Over the past 500 years or so, Europeans have been a bit of a menace. When the Europeans started discovering different countries around the world, they not only ruined the lives of many of the people who lived there, but they almost completely ruined the ecosystem. European explorers have caused the extinction of many plant and animal species around the world, and this is mainly through hunting or the introduction of invasive species. When the Europeans started setting up their lives in new countries, some of them started to feel homesick, and to try and cure this homesickness, they would introduce species from Europe. These introductions are still causing problems today, and it's possible that the invasive species will never completely be controlled. The first invasive species we will be taking a look at in today's video is a freshwater fish, and this freshwater fish is one of the worst invasive species in the world. The brown trout is the most widely distributed member of its genus, and this is really saying something as it's in the same genus as most old world trout species. They are an extremely adaptable fish, and across their range they have numerous ecotypes and subspecies. Brown trout are predatory and anadromous, so they can have a massive effect on aquatic species in freshwater and saltwater ecosystems. They max out at around 20 kilograms, and a fish of this size is capable of feeding on a large amount of fish, amphibians, and crustaceans. The European explorers introduced quite a few European fish outside of their native range, such as the perch and tench in South Africa, and the Eurasian carp into Australia. Brown trout are by far the worst fish introduced by the Europeans, and they have been introduced into North America, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and many more. They were introduced in an attempt to recreate parts of the European ecosystem in different colonies around the world, and they were also a valued food fish and sport fish. The brown trout had the largest impact on island ecosystems, and one of the worst affected was New Zealand. New Zealand has a relatively small amount of native freshwater fish species, and most of these fish fit into 4 different families. The introduction of a large predatory fish had a massive negative effect on the ecosystem, and they are still dominant today. Brown trout occur virtually everywhere in New Zealand south of Auckland, and they are the most widespread invasive fish in the country. They have caused massive declines in native freshwater fish populations, and one of the worst affected groups of fish are the galaxid species. Galaxids are the dominant group of native freshwater fish in New Zealand, and they can appear very trout-like. Most galaxids are smaller than the brown trout, and unfortunately they are also predated on by the brown trout. In an attempt to recreate the European ecosystem, the Europeans almost completely destroyed the New Zealand ecosystem, but hopefully the native fish of New Zealand will be able to bounce back in the future. One way you can travel around the world without any nasty surprises is with today's video partner NordVPN. Summer is here, it's time to get outside, enjoy nature and head down to your local park. But if you find yourself connecting to local Wi-Fi, it's important to be protected because things aren't always as they seem. Some evil individuals will set up fake networks in an attempt to harvest your sensitive data, and if you connect unprotected, there's no way of knowing until it's too late. Encrypt your online traffic today with NordVPN to keep their nasty paws away from your data, and this way you can browse the internet stress-free. You can use my exclusive NordVPN deal plus 4 months extra at nordvpn.com/Tsuki. It's risk-free with NordVPN's 30-day money-back guarantee, and it's currently the best deal for NordVPN. I've personally used NordVPN for years, and it's a great tool to have, and it's also a great way to access shows while you're traveling. It's just 2 clicks away and you can access all the shows you want anywhere in the world. And once again, you can use my exclusive NordVPN deal plus 4 months extra here at nordvpn.com/Tsuki. And thanks to NordVPN for being today's video partner, and now we will move on to our next story. The European rabbit is native to the Iberian Peninsula, France, and the Northern Atlas Mountains, but today they can be found across Europe and all other continents around the world apart from Antarctica. The European rabbit is an example of one of those rare invasive animals that are causing problems around the world but are struggling across their native range. Their numbers have been decreasing across their native range due to predation from the Iberian lynx and the Spanish imperial eagle, but their main problem is infectious diseases. Myxomatosis and RHD have claimed the lives of millions of rabbits, and today they are currently listed as endangered. The European rabbit was introduced into many countries such as Chile for commercial purposes, and in many cases they soon took over due to their rapid breeding rates and lack of natural predators. Once they become established, they are very hard to get rid of, and one of the worst affected countries is Australia. European rabbits were first introduced into Australia in the 18th century with the First Fleet, and they soon took over due to one man by the name of Thomas Austin. Thomas Austin was an English settler and was responsible for introducing quite a few European species into Australia. In 1861, he wrote that he was introducing hares, blackbirds and thrushes, and that he was breeding wild English rabbits and partridges. The rabbits would go on to have the biggest impact on the Australian ecosystem, and originally only 24 breeding rabbits were introduced. The reason behind this introduction was so that Thomas and other settlers could hunt the rabbits like they did in Europe, but their numbers were soon impossible to control. Today there are an estimated 200 million rabbits in Australia, and they inhabit 70% of Australia's landmass. There are quite a few native predators in Australia that will happily target the European rabbits, but they simply breed so quickly that the predators cannot keep up. European rabbits are suspected of being the most significant known factor of species loss in Australia, and this is mostly through overgrazing and their impact on natural resource availability. There have been many unsuccessful attempts to control them over the years, and one of the most brutal methods involved introducing the diseases that they are suffering from across their native range. Some of these methods are effective over a short term, but it seems as though rabbits will be a problem in Australia for many years to come. The European explorers seem to have an obsession with deer, as they would transport different species all over the world. Some species were introduced into different countries as a status symbol and were kept in deer parks, whereas others were introduced for hunting purposes. The Europeans not only introduced deer into newly discovered lands, as they also introduced deer species into Europe. Famously, 4 of the 6 deer species in the UK were introduced, and 3 of these species were introduced from Asia. At first, it may not seem as though deer can cause that much damage to non-native ecosystems, as they are quite calm and peaceful animals, but without natural predators, deer can completely take over an ecosystem. Deer were introduced into New Zealand and Australia in the 19th century, and most of these deer came from English parks in the Scottish Highlands. These animals were introduced so that the settlers would be able to hunt them for sport, but some white-tailed deer were gifted to New Zealand by Theodore Roosevelt and were later introduced. Some Asian species were also introduced in the late 1800s, and today 7 species of deer can be found in New Zealand, and this is more species than most of the settlers knew back home. Famously, New Zealand has very few native land mammal species, and the introduction of 7 species of large deer and other invasive animals was a massive strain on New Zealand's ecosystem. Today, the red deer is the most common species of deer in New Zealand, and they damage the ecosystem by feeding on forest plants, trees, and seedlings. New Zealand has a large number of endemic plant and animal species, and these species haven't evolved with the deer, so they are defenseless against them. There are no predators large enough to hunt deer in New Zealand, so currently the government has to pay professional hunters to control their numbers. Hopefully this situation will improve in the future and we can learn from the mistakes of the past. One of the most famous invasive species in Australia is the red fox. These predators were introduced into Australia from England in the 1800s, and it was intended that they would be hunted by the settlers. Fox hunting is a very outdated and cruel form of hunting in the UK, and even though it's illegal, it's still common in some areas. Introducing an animal into an ecosystem just to brutally kill it is one of the cruelest and stupidest reasons to introduce an animal, and it's had lasting effects on the Australian ecosystem. Red foxes prey on the majority of Australian mammals, and along with a few other invasive species, they have been blamed for the extinction of many Australian animals. In 2012, it was estimated that the red fox population was around 7.2 million in Australia, and the only positive of having them around is that they prey on other invasive species such as the European rabbits. There have been many attempts to control these animals in Australia, but due to their nocturnal habits and denning behaviour, this has been quite difficult. The fox's presence in Australia has made it quite hard for conservationists, as they are unable to reintroduce and release native species because the foxes are still in the area. This introduction is possibly one of the worst introductions carried out by Europeans in Oceania, and it was for the worst reason possible. One of the most annoying things about all of these introductions is that they were simply not needed, and if they didn't happen there would be more interesting species to learn about today. The Europeans discovered strange lands with completely new, weird and wonderful animals, but all they wanted to do was bring over animals from their homeland. One of the worst examples of this was when the Europeans introduced European finches into New Zealand, when New Zealand has some of the most interesting and distinctive birds in the world. Hopefully we can fix the damages caused in the future and maybe native animals will be able to bounce back. Of course, there are quite a few animals that could have made it into this video, so if you think you know of any, then let me know down in the comments below. But thank you for watching, and until next time, goodbye.